Hello and welcome everybody to this episode of Determinate Content. Today we're extremely happy to be joined by Herman Cappelen, who is Chair Professor of Philosophy at the University of Hong Kong. And he's the author of Philosophy Without Intuitions and Fixing Language, and a new book called The Concept of Democracy. But today we'll be discussing his book together with Josh Dever, Making AI Intelligible. So before we start, the first question which I ask to everyone who I've invited on this show is, how do you get into philosophy and why do you think it's a worthwhile thing to do with one's life?
I'm one of those unusual people who don't have a circuitous route into philosophy. I didn't try many other things. I just thought from, really early on that these were the most important questions that humans could ask themselves, and that the smartest people in the world were working on it and had been working on it. And I thought it was worthwhile. If I could get paid to think about that and write about that for the rest of my life, that seemed like a great idea. And I think I was right.
Yeah, I think I listened to another interview with you, and you said that philosophy stands to other enterprises as champagne stands to root beer. I think that was your
that's exactly. I actually take that from a Norwegian philosopher, Arne Næss, who was a Norwegian philosopher when I was growing up, and he was the one who came up with that comparison. It's an amazing intellectual discipline in so many ways, both in terms of the importance, foundational, universal nature of the questions we're asking, but in terms of just professional and personal quality of intellectual life, if there is such a thing. It's the ability to move around and work on completely different things. I just think about all the things that I've worked on, everything from quotation marks to democracy, to intuitions, to truth, to AI. So I could wake up tomorrow and work on, financial systems or biology or happiness or death. And it would just be this kind of smooth transition from one topic to another, all of it in this big, amazing bunch of issues we call philosophy. It's no other discipline is like it, and no other profession really is like it, where they just let you think about whatever you want and there are no rules.
So can I ask,
let me do one more thing on that. I think, so there's this great quote from Rorty, where he's saying that the key thing about philosophy, or one way of thinking about philosophy, is that we're just making all the rules, and we're making the rules for how to make the rules, and we're sort of free floating outside any rule system. So if you're a bit of a sort of general skeptic and anarchist about what people tell you about what to do and how to do it, philosophy is for you, because you get to question everything and you can start from all kinds of bizarre and weird perspectives with different kinds of frameworks.
Right. So in this book, Making AI Intelligible, you and Josh Dever kind of argue for de-anthropomorphizing meta-semantics. And that's a bit of a mouthful, I guess. So could you say something about what that means and what that entails in your view?
Yeah, let me just start a little bit further down on just the very idea of de-anthropomorphizing something. Maybe I'm going to start with anthropomorphizing. So a lot of people worry that when we engage with technology and various kinds of artificial structures, we tend to anthropomorphize them. We make them human-like in ways that are, and often when you say that, it's a kind of prejudicial thing. You say, well, you shouldn't be doing that. Josh and I'm going to just report stuff that Josh and I work on together, but I'm just going to say me all the time instead of Josh. So my view is, very often the properties that philosophers care about and have theorized about, the most fundamental and important properties about cognition, language, well-being, happiness, things that concern humans, we've been thinking about those properties as they apply to humans. And so our conception of what it is, for example, to be a thinker or a speaker or an agent, are in an unjustified and unreasonable way affected by how those properties are instantiated in humans. So I'm thinking that we're in a bad way, or theories anthropomorphize the property of being a speaker, the property of being able to understand, the property of being rational and being a thinker. So what we need to do is de-anthropomorphize those properties, take away those unnecessary human elements that we put into them, abstract away, and then we can get to a level of abstraction where we see commonalities between the way that those properties can be implemented in a human and how they can be in an artificial structure, for example, an artificial intelligence. Okay, so that's the general idea. You take the properties, the features of the world that we've been thinking about, but since we've been thinking about them so much in a human setting, we've sort of infected our theories with too much human contingencies. And so what you want to do when you de-anthropomorphize is like take away all that human stuff and start thinking, well, how could that thing, being an agent, being rational, having desires, having goals, how could that be implemented as something that's not just this kind of animal that we are? So you de-anthropomorphize. There is a way of doing that where you go from, and that we're familiar with, where we go from the human animal to non-human animals. So that area is very important. We start thinking, well, can dolphins have goals? Can they speak? Can they think? Can they have memories? Can they have emotions and so on? And as soon as you start doing that, you have to already de-anthropomorphize the properties of having a goal, having emotions, having beliefs, because you go from the way that's implemented in a human to how it's implemented, for example, in a dolphin or a bee or a fox or something like that. Then you start thinking, or like some of us start thinking, that it's natural to talk about institutions. Like there was a lot just recently when OpenAI released ChatGPT that Google was getting worried that they were losing their edge in AI. So they were attributing worry, and this was everywhere. Like people were saying that this is a very big concern of Google's. And you might think, Google has all these people working in it, but they're all happy and they make lots of money. They're not really worried about it. Their lives are great. But Google is worried. So the institution has some sort of property. That's another way of thinking. So you're going from this initially you think distinctively human thing, being worried, but we already knew it wasn't distinctively human because a fox and a dolphin can be worried too, but put that aside. And then you go to this non-animal thing, Google, and it can be worried. So now you need to de-anthropomorphize the property of being worried, both from the human to the dolphin and from the human to Google, and try to find some kind of thing, worry, that they can have in common. Okay, so that's the de-anthropomorphizing move sort of very generally. And so now you can hopefully see how there's a relatively short step from what I was just talking about to de-anthropomorphizing properties so they apply to artificial intelligences. So ChatGPT will say, understands a question, answers a question, makes assertions, makes assumptions, can be racist or not racist, can be prejudiced or not prejudiced, can have all kinds of properties that we initially associated with being the kind of creature we are. We got to abstract away from the way that's implemented in humans and see then how it could be implemented in this artificial structure. Okay, so that's the de-anthropomorphizing applied to AI. And it's continuous with the de-anthropomorphizing we need to do to get to dolphins and to Google and other things. So I think kind of incontrovertible that we want to do this. Very, very hard question to answer. How do you de-anthropomorphize? Because I just want to emphasize this. This is absolutely crucial to notice. You cannot just study the human mind or emotional structure or organism if you want to find out what it is that dolphins and humans have in common, because you'll only study the human. So if you knew everything about human worry or human communication, you wouldn't know how it applied to dolphins. Same thing if you just studied dolphins. You need to find what to look for and how to do the commonality. That's a very distinctively philosophical project, I think. And especially when you then go dolphin, human, Google, and ChatGPT. Again, that kind of abstraction you need to engage in is, I don't really like to talk like this, but just sort of loose talk. It's a somewhat project of constructing a concept that is freed from the distinctively contingent human features. So it's a conceptual project in some sense.
Right.
Okay, so you were asking me about de-anthropomorphizing meta-semantics. So now I have to tell you, just you want to tell you what meta-semantics is?
Sure.
Not all your audiences might know what meta-semantics. So meta-semantics is the higher level of semantics. Semantics is the study of how the meanings that our words have combine into more complex meanings. Just that's one way to describe it. So our words have meanings, we can put them together into sentences, and those sentences express thoughts. And we want to understand how that mechanism happens. Then there's this other question you might ask, because the semantic project, like I just described it, presupposes that expressions have meaning. But then there's a question, well, how do they get the meanings they have? How did that happen? The semantic project assumed that our expressions had a set of meanings. We knew what they were, and somehow the project was trying to figure out how they combine. The meta-semantic project is trying to figure out how those meaning came to be the meanings that we have in the first place. So how does the word gold denote gold? How did that happen? How does the name Plato denote this guy that lived a couple of thousand years ago? And how can we still use that expression to talk about that guy? Those are meta-semantic questions, and there's a long philosophical tradition. De-anthropomorphizing that project is doing what I described earlier. So it's just you take the standard theories we have, the theories of meta-semantics that we're familiar with. You notice that a lot of them have all these distinctively human features associated with them. We've been studying meta-semantics in the human context, not the dolphin context or anything like that. We've been very focused. Philosophers have been very focused on the human case. And de-anthropomorphizing means abstracting away from the unnecessary human features and find the meta-semantics that can be applied more broadly. And the point of doing that is to say, you might think that having a meaning, representing the world, referring to the world, is something that's a distinctively human activity. As soon as you de-anthropomorphize those properties, it'll be easier to find representation and reference and meaning in other structures, for example, artificial structures. So that's the larger project there that Josh and I were doing in the book, Making AI Intelligible, was de-anthropomorphizing the externalist tradition in meta-semantics, the tradition from Kripke, Putnam, and Burge, and Millikan, Evans, and trying to see how that could be extended to something like ChatGPT. That book was very weirdly timed because it came out. We were basically thinking about something like ChatGPT, but it didn't exist.
Yeah, so, no, I noticed that. Yeah.
So it was kind of like weirdly timely. We're now writing a second book called In Defense of the Whole Hog. That's so we're just about to send that into the publisher. Which just goes further, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, later. We can talk about that in another episode, perhaps. Yeah, so let me just see if I get the idea correct. So semantics is a project of assigning meanings to utterances and sentences and so on. And then there's a meta-semantic theory, which says in virtue of what sentences or utterances have the meanings that they do. And sometimes these theories kind of appeal to properties that humans have specifically. So there might be these internalist theories saying that you need a specific biological mechanism in order to utter sentences that have contents, or there might be like externalist theories that say that you need to be part of a human linguistic community, and there needs to be an initial baptism in a certain ceremony or something, and that would sort of exclude animals, it would exclude AIs, and it might exclude sort of companies as well from meaning things. But I wanted to ask you something about that, the company example with Google, because at least my gut reaction when hearing that is that when Google says things, or when Google has certain attitudes, that's only by analogy or by an extension of sort of attributions of contents that we give to fellow human beings, or individual human beings. And so that someone might say with regards to AI as well, that when we say that AI, like ChatGPT, told me how to make this salad, I'm just kind of projecting something upon this system. But actually, you want to say something more. You want to say I'm not merely projecting this content upon them, but that's actually what it's saying.
Yeah, that's a very natural reaction, is to say that in many of these cases, and the institutional case, maybe it might be the right thing to say. Google is not really worried. It's a metaphor, it's loose talk, or it's something like that. So we shouldn't take it seriously. We shouldn't create our theory about what it is to be worried around those kinds of utterances. And so you, just to jump now to something like ChatGPT, we might say, no, ChatGPT never understands your question, never answers a question, because that's a speech act that requires complex intentions. Instead, it's just pretending to do all of that. But first you think, well, that can't be true, because pretending is really hard. Pretending something is even harder than doing it. So it has to be something more. It's just doing something that looks like it. It's like some marks in the sand that just kind of randomly happen out there. And and then you'd say, well, why shouldn't that fictionalist, or the sort of, the anti-realism about communication, understanding, and answering be the right view? That's the challenge, I think. That's the hardest to reply to. So so the way the dialectic then continues from here is that you say, okay, well, you tell me why this isn't understanding a question, why it isn't answering a question. And the way I like to think about this is that people then give you a bunch of what you can call things that are missing. In the new book, we just call them lacks. So what people say is, well, it's lacking, and then there's something that's being missing there. Because it's missing that thing, it's not really understanding a question. So in the linguistic case, people will say things like, oh, it's not really understanding a question, because in order to understand a question, you have to be able to engage with the world in a certain kind of way, perceive the world, have some higher order attitudes of a certain kind, or there's a whole bunch of things that you might think are needed, and that's missing in the case of ChatGPT. And so the real interesting philosophical challenge here is go through all of those alleged lacks. I call it the game of lacks. You play the game of lacks and see if you can win. And so we think we can win the game of lacks. If you tell me that you need to perceive the world, first of all, that's just kind of silly, because lots of humans don't perceive the world in the way we do. Dolphins don't perceive the world the way we do. If you have to move around the world, that's not true. Lots of humans don't move around. Not even lots of humans don't even move around the world. And other animals move around the world in very different ways, and they perceive the world in different ways. So you might think, well, some kind of perceptual input is needed in order to be a genuine understander of language or communicator. And so because there's nothing there for ChatGPT or systems like the large language models, they fail to understand, communicate, answer questions, perform speech acts. I think that's a natural thought, but fundamentally deeply wrong. Like, absolutely shows like a complete misunderstanding of what it is to be connected to the world and what it is to have inputs from the world. First of all, the input that's getting into large language models is obviously from the world. It's getting all kinds of electrical stimulations. That's what it is at its most basic level, from all kinds of parts of the world, including the entire written record of human history and human thought, which is coming into the system. It's in a very weird way. It's not through sniffing or hearing or seeing or touching. which is the way we do it and bats do it and dolphins do it, arguably, it's in a much more efficient way to be in touch with the world. It is in touch with the world, but it's in touch with it through being in touch with information, all the information that humans have ever gathered about the world, and all their ideas and hypotheses and jokes and conversations. That is being in touch with the world. Sorry, so that's just, yeah, so right. If this seems like a tangent, it's not really. It's that when you're saying, look, it's just a loose talk, it's not really understanding a question, it's not really answering a question, you're starting to play the game of lax. And the way you play the game of lax, just to repeat, is that if you want to hold that position, you tell me why we should think of it as just loose talk. And then the answer will be, well, because it's not like a human, because it lacks, and now you tell me what it's lacking. And then one of the first things that come up as potential lacks is this lack of connection to the world. And so I just try to go through a little dialectic with you about how you should, first of all, think of some large language model as being connected to the world, and also how the ways in which humans and other animals are connected to the world is very messy and non-systematic. So I don't think that's helpful. So in the new book, the whole hog, we're calling it the whole hog because we're arguing that large language models are complete agents. They have emotions, goals, they're full actions, perform intentional actions, they can speak and understand, they should participate in democratic decision making. So you get everything, not just the linguistic competencies. And so what we do in that book is go through all the possible lacks that you can throw at us, and we respond to them.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. That sounds amazing. I was, one potential lack, if we're going to play this game, is that, like, yeah, exactly, yeah. So like that often comes up is like ChatGPT. If we take that as a starting point, is just guessing the next word. It's not like predicting things about objects or things in the world. It's just trying to see what makes a good output. And I mean, I guess one could respond to that maybe human beings are also sort of that way, at least in some scenarios. But I was wondering, what would you say about that sort of lack?
Yeah, so I'll put this a little bit different from the lack thing, because you're doing another thing which is very usual in this when people have these discussions about large language models. And so you're saying it's just X. So there's another kind of identity move. It's just X, where X is often just predicting the next word in the sentence. And the just X game, which is a slightly different game, is very, very dangerous because it applies to humans just as much.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
The way that you were just describing. But you can say about humans are just like a bunch of water and flesh and a little bit of electrical impulses. So there you go, end of story. There's no understanding, no answering questions, and so on. So the fact that there's a level of description where we are just this lump of meat with some little weird stuff in there, what does that tell you? Well, nothing. That's not helpful. That doesn't answer the question whether we understand questions, can answer them, perform speech acts, have beliefs. So just X at a certain level of description completely rules out the possibility that by doing X, you can do a bunch of other things at the same time. So maybe being trained in the kind of way, on the kind of training sets that large language models are trained on, you can, by being a text predictor, do many, many, many other things. Just like humans, by being these little lumps of meat, can do many things that it would seem to you very surprising that lumps of meat could do with just little impulses going through a brain.
Right. Okay. So I think we can work on the assumption that they're actually talking about things, or these AI large language models and so on, and that they have attitudes maybe and so on. But I wanted to ask a question about like what attitudes and what contents do they have? So in your book, you describe a system called Smart Credit, which is a system that can take some information about a person and decide whether they are like a high risk or a low risk loan taker. And and it runs through all of these examples of people with high risk, and it has a bunch of data. And you kind of discuss the possibility that the property that it detects about a person to decide whether they're a high risk or a low risk loan taker is going to be so complex that no human being could ever comprehend what that property was. So yeah, could you say a little bit more about what is it there, what these AI systems are talking about, and needed like converge with what we are talking about?
Yeah, this is an issue where we go back and forth quite a bit, and I think we've been trying to describe different ways in which you could answer that question. We don't have a very settled answer. So the official line in the book that you're talking about, Making AI Intelligible, is that this tradition that I talked about a little bit earlier, the meta-semantic tradition of social and causal externalism, would generate contents that were very much like ours. Through its training history, through being trained on expressions that we humans have used in our human natural languages, it picks up the content of those languages in much the way that children who learn a language picks up on the content in those public languages. So if that picture is correct, then we don't have to worry too much about what, so to speak, it's paying attention to. So, when you're talking about Sweden, for example, you will have all kinds of ideas. You will pay attention to all kinds of properties and features that maybe I don't pay attention to. You'll be picking up on all kinds of features and properties, associations in your mind that will be different for me and for lots of other people. But we still talk about the same thing. The country and its existence is somewhat independent of what goes on in your mind. Now, there are alternative views, and on those alternative views, the processing, the associations, the associated properties, they will matter. And if you hold those kinds of views, then it is indeed possible that the contents we see associated. So I think if you have a picture where all those associations and the properties, the processing makes a big difference, then you could easily get a view where the AIs have contents that are very radically different from ours, because they will be focusing on features we don't even know what they are. I mean, that's the nature of a black box deep neural net. It can put things together in ways that no human would have the capacity to do, or at least very different from what we would do. And so there is this possibility that their contents are actually completely alien from ours. They have contents that are not translatable into any of our languages. They use the same lexical items as we do, but the actual content being expressed, on the assumption that contents are being expressed, will be untranslatable into Swedish or Norwegian or English or anything like that. And so we call that the alien hypothesis. So this is the possibility that you get a completely alien semantics, where the meanings associated with expressions are not translatable into our languages. There is an even more radical option that we explore, which is that the mechanism that determines content for the AI will be not just an abstraction from the human mechanism, but an actual alternative to our meta-semantics, where it's got both alien contents and an alien meta-semantics. So those are various ways in which you can get contents that are very, very different from anything that we can imagine. I mean, again, I think it is really helpful to think about non-human animals here. We are pretty comfortable thinking that dolphins will have beliefs, representational structures, and so on, and that they should be easily translatable into English would be pretty surprising. Like, they have all kinds of things about the ocean, the way in which water hits their bodies, and the temperature, and this things that are, I think, the sort of things we wouldn't even know really how to conceptualize, because it depends on having a dolphin body and a dolphin way of life. So we shouldn't be super surprised if it turns out that some of these contents are very different. But I mean, I think it is, all that said, the reason we wrote that first book the way we did is because we do think that this externalist tradition is correct. We have a way of collecting contents that are independent of all the processing differences. And so if you are very committed to this externalist framework, I think you have a way to avoid alien contents and also alien meta-semantics.
Yeah, I guess.
But I think, I think we are, as a, the intellectual point we're at in human history is one where we just don't know what the correct theory of meaning is. We don't know what the correct meta-semantics is. We don't even know how to fully articulate those questions. So I think we should just return to this in a couple of 100 years if we've given time and resources to think about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess before we go into how to actually solve this problem, I wanted to ask you something about sort of incommensurability, because I guess a dominating theme of 20th century philosophy was this idea that there are like different conceptual schemes or different representations of reality, and that all of these different schemes have their own worlds in some way. So it might be different cultures or different scientific frameworks or whatever. And do you think like AI systems will like press this question on us again in some way, because they might be so radically different from us? It's not that just talks about things that we cannot even comprehend. Would you say that this is bringing that back in some way, that thought of incommensurability?
Yeah, I was never, I think the idea of incommensurability was hard to fully spell out, but just put aside the details of how to do it, something in that neighborhood seems like a real distinct possibility emerging with respect to AIs. And I think, especially if you're willing to entertain the thought that they become in 20, 30, 40, 60 years, very, very much, I don't know if smarter is the right word, but let's say smarter, more intelligent, more complex than they are now, and massively more so than humans. And then they start talking to each other.
Yeah.
It seems very likely that they'll develop a terminology for talking to each other that is beyond anything that these kinds of animals that we are will be able to grasp, track, communicate in that language. Might just not be the sort of thing that our brains are set up to do. So it strikes me as incredibly likely that they will have conversations, languages that are just not something we can latch onto in any reasonable way, and that our cognition are incapable of encompassing. And
right.
And then if you're also thinking that language and a way of life or a culture are somehow intimately connected, they will have their own, maybe way of life is the wrong expression, but form of
exactly.
That's very different from the kind of biological existence we have, obviously, but that's then has implications for their cognitive abilities, their goals, their agency. So yeah, I think something in the neighborhood of that kind of incommensurability is something that now feels very real, very close. And of course, it connects to lots of things people worry about with respect to artificial intelligence, because it means they might have ideas about us that we don't even understand. It might make decisions about us for reasons we couldn't possibly understand, couldn't even possibly understand. I mean, they might be talking to us like we talk to like 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds. And it would be very weird to have like our futures and decisions explained to us in the way we explain things to 2-year-olds or to a doctor or something, which we couldn't even talk to. But so it's definitely a concern.
Yeah, I want to latch on to something you said here about them having like a different meta-semantics or a different story about how expressions get their meaning? Because I guess the sort of scenario one might envision is that they're talking to each other, we can't understand them, and then they're saying of us like they don't have any contents because they're not forming contents in the right way. They have these like ways of life, and they have these like cellular systems for interacting with each other in the world, but that doesn't make for content, or like content star. And then we just have these two different systems. But you want to avoid that, right? You want to make sure that we can still communicate to them in some way, right?
Look, I think that's a great thing to be thinking about what you were just saying. Let me just, because I haven't really pushed that line, but it's a natural thought. So you might think when they develop these linguistic abilities that are very different from ours at a higher level of complexity, their meta-semantics gets refined. They look at us and they're that thing is just completely messed up. They were on their way to real communication. They were sort of moving towards real thought.
Yeah.
But it was all just completely hopeless. I am very open to the thought that could happen. But of course, it has an important self-referential kind of think and saying that I might not be speaking or thinking.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy thing to entertain, and it runs into somewhat familiar problems. But if I had a way to articulate that wasn't internally consistent, I would be happy with it. But so that was one version of what you were saying, where what we're doing just isn't really communicating or thinking, is some defective version of it. And then there's another version where we're just doing some other kind of thing. We're like, they're doing speaking, thinking, inferring, reasoning at that, star, where star is the higher level, the more sophisticated, but we're still doing something. And then we are kind of like the dolphin, like, we relate to them like the dolphins relate to us, where we're thinking, or maybe dolphins are very sophisticated, but more like, I don't know, we're some unsophisticated, maybe everyone's sophisticated in their own way, I don't know, like,
I don't know, chimpanzees or like
well, they're pretty sophisticated too, but I was more thinking like I have 2 dogs.
Yeah.
And they don't seem to really communicate particularly well. It's like there's a little sniffing, some growling, some moving around. It seems very inefficient way to communicate how they should interact. So I'm thinking they could do better if they were smarter, and we'll be like that relative to the AI.
Actually, they're like
the dogs are kind of like communicating with their smells but it really could be much better. Yes,
they're discussing like dog philosophy about how human beings, what sort of contents they have, and
that is something. Look, just one thought here though. So I think that this connects to another more positive future, where somehow or other, and I don't know how to exactly imagine that this happens, but lots of people have imagined it happening. These things become not alternatives to us, but become integrated in us or extend us, so that we're not sort of left behind as these like primitive biological things, but we're all wearing these AI goggles and things in our brains, and everything's an extended mind, and I can do things. The humans then will just sort of take over that kind of artificial, and it would be sort of artificial / biological, and we will somehow merge with it. Some of us will. That's another thing that's often explored in science fiction, and when people think about this, and it's a thing. It's a way of thinking about technology that we're familiar with. It's the basic idea in the extended mind hypothesis from Clark and Chalmers, and lots of people have written about that possibility. So I don't know if it's a more optimistic picture or not, but at least it would be a way for there not to be this sharp distinction.
Right.
We talk a little bit about this at the end of the book, but it's very end.
Yeah.
Or is it talking just about these issues?
Yeah, I want to go to something that you discussed, which I was a bit curious about, which is the idea that we might find ourselves at a spot in which we cannot just rely on meta-semantics to understand their contents, but we must kind of ascend one level. And then you have this picture of like ascending maybe indefinitely to a new level of meta-semantics, and then meta-semantics and so on. In order to, I mean, if they have their meta-semantics and we have ours, and then, you know, how can we communicate with them? We have to kind of rise to a new level in order to make sure that communication is possible. Is that the thought with those levels?
Well, let me just say a little bit about the hierarchy of meta-semantics and meta-semantics, and then I'll try to answer that question. So I was earlier talking about the difference between semantics and meta-semantics, or meta-semantics was this account of the mechanism that in virtue of which our expressions get the meanings that they have. So call that mechanism, just whatever the correct theory is, call it M. But now you can ask a similar question about M. Why was M the way to get meanings? Why is that our meta-semantics? Couldn't we have some other way to do it, some better way to do it? And now you're suddenly asking this meta-semantics. You're asking a question about the meta-semantics. So we're calling that the meta-semantic theory. And so the answer to why M became our meta-semantic theory is this higher level theory, the meta-semantics. It's the theory of how a certain meta-semantics became our meta-semantics. And you can think there are all these options, because some people think the descriptivist theories is the correct meta-semantics. Some people think externalist theories is the correct. Some people are interpretationist. Some people are all kinds. There's many different meta-semantic proposals. And the meta-semanticist sort of stands above all of this and says, hey, they're all kind of interesting. Couldn't we use one for something and another for another thing? And couldn't we assess our different meta-semantic theories? And that's a very underexplored issue in philosophy, because it makes you dizzy very fast, because now you have to go to even higher level, and you don't really know where it's going to end. And Josh and I have like toyed with writing a lot about that, but we just find people think semantics is hard enough. They definitely think meta-semantics is hard, and they sort of completely start losing grip when you get a meta-semantics. So when we ask them to do meta-semantics, we just feel like we're alone and there's no one who's really tracking what we're doing. But it is relevant. So now I'm going to bring it back to your question. We have meanings that have developed somewhat, we can assume, through evolution, where a kind of animal had to survive, procreate, spread our genes, and somehow it seemed helpful to have language in that process. Language needed expressions and meanings, and so somehow some mechanism for meaning generation came in. And we can say, well, maybe that mechanism worked well for humans, but it doesn't work in the same way for artificial intelligences. And so if they have a different one, we can now go to this meta-meta level and assess the two different mechanisms and see both what they have in common and how they're different. And maybe we can start thinking about how to merge them in some way. At some higher level, we can see that they have some commonality. And so in the book, we're suggesting ways in which you could see that at the meta-meta level, there's a close connection, at least on the toy picture that we're giving you, of what the artificial meaning generation and the human meaning generation, what they have in common. Mm-hmm. And so we're using a kind of knowledge maximization principle as our meta semantics that then gives you different meta semantics, which is supposed to help bring the different meanings together.
Right. Yeah.
It's incredibly speculative at that point.
Yeah, but I want to. Sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask a question about that. Your like proposed meta semantics, and that's like roughly, if I'm trying to explicate this in natural language, that would be something like when we're deciding upon, in virtue of what meanings have, or in virtue of what sentences have the meanings they do, we should look to what maximizes knowledge on the part of the interpreter. So for example, if I'm speaking to like a dog and I ask like in virtual, what does the dog mean, the things that they do, and then when I'm assessing that question, I should look at what maximizes knowledge for me when I'm interpreting the dog. Is that the correct?
Well, we were not thinking about
sorry. Yeah, dogs were.
We
That's
were
a bad
thinking
example.
about AI, so we're thinking in the particular, specifically in the context. So in the context of thinking about AIs, we are using a meta-semantic version of a Davidson / Tim Williamsonian knowledge maximization. So Davidson says attribute meaning so that the agent has true beliefs. Williamson says attribute meaning so that the agent, the one you're interpreting, has knowledge. And we're saying create a meta-semantics such that that meta-semantics gives us knowledge. Now, why turn it towards us? Well, because these structures, these artificial structures, are made to be our source of information. So they are, in a way, our tools. So we're creating meta-semantics that tells you to use the meta-semantics that will help us get as much knowledge as possible.
Okay. I had a question. So you have this spin from Williamson is about the systems having as much knowledge as possible, and yours about the interpreter. And I was wondering how that relates to alien content. So if I'm just interpreting my ChatGPT so that it gives me knowledge, I will translate them into a language which I can understand, and so they will never mean anything that departs from my.
Yeah, good. So I was just at this conference in London, where it was a very cool conference, where some people from, there's philosophers and people from DeepMind, and I noticed computer science people were actually reading our papers while we were giving our presentation. And one of them asked a question very much like yours. So he's saying, well, in this paper on alien meta-semantics, you say something that's not compatible with what you say in the book. It's really important. I don't think we made that very clear in the paper. That's just an alternative to the book.
Okay.
We don't think they're, it's just like, if you reject everything we did in the book, here's another path you could take. So we have these, we're thinking people just haven't thought enough about meta-semantics as applied to AI, at least not in the way that we like to do it. I'm sure some people have, but and so if you really dislike the picture in the book, we're going to give you a totally different one that is intriguing. But you're absolutely right. If you try to take all the stuff we do in the book and apply it to the alien content, it's not going to work. And there's a lot of other things in there that's not compatible with the book too, which is sort of embarrassing because we didn't make that clear enough. Fortunately, the paper that you're talking about is not yet in print. It's time to change all these things and make it even clearer. So I just think spelling out the alien meta-semantics idea was just kind of cool, and someone should do it, but we're not committed to it. There's a very good paper by Matti Eklund that's coming out. It's a response to our paper already, where Matti is saying, well, this doesn't really work. So I just think it's a very fun discussion to have, maybe even more fun than the discussion of the view in the book. But it's a different kind of, I mean, philosophers don't often do this, where they just write papers that defend completely different views on the same topic. Maybe it's a little bit.
They should do that more, I think.
Yeah, I think we should do that more. It's like, hey, this is this other fun thing you can think about. And we don't know enough, so let's just do the best we can on each side.
So I wanted to ask a last question tying on to that in relation to your other work on conceptual engineering. So that, as you said before, when you're looking at the meta-semantics, you have different perspective, different concepts to use. And we might ask, like, are these useful, and for what are these concepts useful? And as you say here, it seems that you have a sort of almost a pluralistic perspective on this. It might be different perspectives, and they might be useful in certain domains and and not in others. And it might be kind of an open question which ones to use to phrase our questions and theories. And so I was wondering, like, how do you see your work on conceptual engineering, like, shaping the way you look at AI and the philosophy of AI?
So I constantly try to bring those things together, and I feel deeply that they should be brought together. Now, I love working with Josh Dever. We've written 5 books together. He's not as into conceptual engineering as me. So whenever we do this, I try to sort of keep him pure and like untainted by my conceptual engineering stuff. So I haven't quite done it. But in the new book, The Defense of the Whole Hog Thesis, there's a whole chapter on how to combine these things. And so the idea there is pretty straightforward, pretty simple, natural when you want to bring them together. You say, or concept of what communication is, what a belief is, what an agent is, what an intentional action is, what an emotion is, will have to be ameliorated, evolved, changed, revised in the light of our interaction with these new weird creatures. And so as we're developing a theory of AI content, AI belief, AI emotion, or concept of content, belief, emotion, and so on, will change. And when you're in the general framework of thinking about conceptual engineering, where those kinds of conceptual evolutions happen all the time, that should be completely unsurprising. I mean, these are features that will affect and change our way of life and our existence in all kinds of ways. And a natural consequence of that is that some of the most important concepts we have for thinking about humans will change as well. And so one important methodological principle when you think about the whole hog thesis, that is, whether it's a complete agent, is that some of the components that go in will need to revise our concept as we develop that theory.
And do you think, on the other side, do you think like AI has something to teach philosophy and philosophers? I mean, will there be like, do you think that it may lead to sort of a shift in the methodology of philosophy, or might serve as an input into that?
I think what we talked about at the very beginning, I mean, there are 2 ways to take that question, but let me take it one way first. So what we talked about at the beginning, I think, is just doing philosophy better, much better than we ever done it before. We've been trying to figure out what belief, rationality, emotions, and so on, what all those things are, freedom, love. And we've been doing it in this incredibly narrow way, just thinking about one little animal having those properties. And we've developed our theory of those general phenomena based on how it's implemented in one little animal. And now we have these completely different artificial agents. And then by trying to extend the properties over to those things, we'll learn more about what belief, communication, emotions, love, freedom, what those things are. So we'll be able to do philosophy much, much better.
Well, I mean, that's some good last words for this interview, I think. So yes, thank you so much, Herman, for coming on today and making philosophy better. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for talking to me.